Hello! This is going to be a video where I'm going to give a quick overview of CSS. And what does CSS stand for? It stands for Cascading Style Sheets. And CSS works with HTML to provide the kind of visual element of what we see on web pages, to really make web pages look the way we want them to look. So if HTML is about the structure and content of the web page, CSS is about how you shape that structure and content to look appealing or to look like what you want, or to just experiment with it and make web pages that maybe look kind of weird. And so the key concept in CSS is this idea of selection and then styling. So we need to be able to pick out different parts of a web page, which we can do in different ways, and then we need to be able to say what we want them to look like and how we want them to be laid out as well. And so there's different places that we can put our CSS, but we are going to put it in a file, just because it feels like it's, generally speaking, the clearest way of doing things, and it's a nice separation between the structural stuff that HTML provides and the styling stuff that CSS provides. But there are other places that you can put CSS, notably inside a style tag in your HTML file, or in style attributes with individual elements on your web page. You can look at the notes if you want to know more about how that works. Again, as with the HTML overview, the objective here is not to become an epic master of CSS. That would be a very long process because it's a very large technology. What we want is to be able to get the basics working, which is we want to be able to select things on our web page and we want to be able to style them with CSS. So let's look at how to do that, okay? The way that we're going to do it is, first of all, we need a website to actually look at. So I am going to go over to my Cart263 repository and into my web page folder, and I'm going to make a new folder, which I'm going to call CSS-Overview. Learning my lesson from when I called my other folder HTML, which seemed confusing. So I've got my CSS Overview folder. That's where my website is going to live. I'm going to drag that into Atom. So right now it's empty, of course. So before it makes sense to look at any CSS, we're going to need some HTML, because CSS is meaningless without HTML to style. So to do that, I am going to paste some HTML into this empty document here. I have that prepared in my notes. You can paste it in yourself as well if you're following along. And I'm going to save this as index.html inside my folder. Index.html, the classic name, right? So now it gets its nice highlighting, and you can see it's just some fairly basic HTML that will give us a simple web page. So let's look at what it looks like quickly with Atom Live Server. Off we go. I've put it in the wrong place, so I'm now going to switch across to Chrome, and I'm going to pop it down here. There we go. So we have a very basic web page with some headings, some paragraphs, some emphasis, and a link. And a little bit of structural stuff underneath, like sections and a footer and a header, for example. So the very, very basics of HTML. This gives us something that we can then start to use with CSS. So if we're going to write some CSS, as I said, there's different places we can do it, but we're going to do it inside a CSS file. So the most common thing to do, or a good, at least at the very least, a good practice here is let's create a new folder. So I'm going to right click on my main folder, and I'm going to create a new folder called CSS. And inside this folder, I'm going to make a new file. And the typical thing that we call our CSS file is style.css. You can call it something else, that's completely fine, and people have different conventions. Some people might call this main.css because it's going to be the main style file, but style.css is a good option. So, bam. So now we have an empty CSS file, and that's obviously not going to do anything because it's empty. But the other reason that our CSS right now wouldn't do anything is that there's no connection between index.html and style.css, right? So we, like with all of these sorts of things, and we're familiar with this when we try and write JavaScript for a page, right, that we have to include a script tag. We have a special kind of tag in our HTML that we need to include in order to be able to say, use this specific CSS file. Because this is information about the kind of meta nature of the page, it's not part of the content of the page, we include it inside our head tag. I'm going to make a little space there just because it makes me feel better. So inside our head tag, we include what is called a link tag, which is used to link other files into our web page. So we write link, and then we use attributes to specify that we're going to include a style sheet. So the first thing that we can say is where the file is, and that's going to be an href that points to a file. And we know that our CSS file is in the CSS folder, and it's called style.css. So that tells it where the file is to link. And the other thing that we should do is we should add this rel attribute, which I'm not 100% sure what rel even stands for, which is maybe embarrassing, but there you go. Rel, this is where we tell it what kind of file this is, and the kind of file is a style sheet. Then we just close the tag there. This is another one of those tags where we do not need the / closing tag. It's just a tag all on its own like this. So this links our style.css file, this file here, which is empty. It links it to the HTML, and this means that when we type CSS into our style file, it's going to be applied to the web page. So right now, of course, there's no CSS, so it's not impacting on our page at all. But as we add CSS information to the style file now, we will see it take effect on this page. For now, it's still just using the defaults because there's no style. Okay, so what do we need to know about CSS to make something happen? The great thing about CSS is that conceptually it is not complicated, okay? The complication with CSS is entirely about this huge proliferation of possibilities. It's not about understanding how it works, because how it works is fairly simple. There's basically two concepts. The first concept is we need to be able to specify which part of our page we want to apply a style to. And we can do that in a number of ways, but whichever way we do it, it is called a selector. So it selects a part of the HTML. The simplest kind of selector is to select a tag. So for example, if we want to apply a style to everything inside this body tag here, which is everything on our web page, we write the name of the tag, so body, right? So if I write body here, that is going to be my selector. It's going to select the body element of the page, and whatever CSS, whatever the properties I specify now are, they're going to be applied to the body. So how do we tell it what to do? We always have curly brackets afterwards, and this is inside here is where we're going to list all of the things that we want to do. It's a little bit like a JavaScript object. So here's the selector, that's what to apply the style to, and then inside curly brackets we list the style that we want to apply. Now, this is where CSS balloons out and becomes huge because there are a lot of things that we could say in here. But let's start simple. Let's say I want to change the font. The property that I used to change the font is called font family. So I say font hyphen family. That's me telling CSS, this is what I want to set on the body. Then I have a colon, just like in JavaScript. That's saying I'm going to give you the value, and you can see some basic values in here, right? So it says cursive, fantasy, inherit, monospace, sans serif, and serif. Those are things that I could type in. What I'm going to type in is the name of a specific font, which is Helvetica, which I find to be a nice font, and it's a sans serif font. Now, the final thing I do is I include a semicolon. Now I'm specifying, this is completely valid CSS now. So select the body, which is the entire HTML content, and then in the curly brackets, I specify what do I want to do? What kind of style do I want to apply? And I'm saying I want to set the font family property, colon, to say what I'm going to set it to, and I want to set it to the font Helvetica. And I just write the name of the font, right? There's no quotation marks listed here in this instance. Just Helvetica and a semicolon to say that's the end of this instruction. So if I save that, which I just did, and I switch back across to the browser, the page is now in Helvetica, right? You may or may not remember what it used to look like. Let me delete this for a second and save. So now there's nothing. We get the default. As you can see, this is in a serif font. It's probably Times New Roman or something along those lines. Serifed. And if I bring back my styling and say I want you to set the font family of the entire body, the entire page, to Helvetica, now the font has changed and we're in Helvetica, okay? And that's what CSS does, okay? At the fundamental level, that is all that you need to know about CSS in terms of the concept of what it works, of how it works. Everything else that we add on to it and that makes CSS complicated is just the sheer range of possibilities. But the fundamental idea is you select some part of the page, like the body, and you set a property or properties that you want to affect on that part of the page. So let us at least drill down a little bit, because I don't feel like maybe that's enough to really catch on to CSS. So let's look at a few more things that are really worth knowing, okay? One thing that is worth knowing, particularly in the context of fonts, because this does come up, is if you specify a specific font here and the user doesn't have it, say some poor person, some poor deprived person doesn't have Helvetica on their computer, then they're going to get the default font instead. So if they didn't have Helvetica, then they're going to get Times New Roman or some kind of serifed font probably. And that's not what I want to do, right? And CSS is very much about controlling the visual appearance. So I want to control for the situation where the font is not available. And the way that we can do this with fonts is we can specify one or more fallback options. So I can do a comma, and then I can say, if they don't have Helvetica, then use a sans serif font. Sans serif. That's a no serif font, right? Sans serif in French. This way, if this doesn't work, it'll use a much more generic idea, which is just use the default sans serif font on the user's computer. And that way, I know for sure that my page is going to be rendered sans serif, which is what I want. So font family and its fallback options, that's just an important thing to know about how that works. Okay, so that's a fallback option. Now, what else is important to know? Well, a really important thing to know is that obviously we don't just have to style the entire body of our page. Right now, our selector is body, and so it's affecting everything inside the body tag. So it's affecting the header, the H1, the section, the H2, the P, the M, the other H2, the other P, the strong tag, the A tag, etc. It's affecting everything inside the body. It's not usually the case that we just only want to style the entire body. So we want to be able to more specifically select things. And again, we can just use a tag name, right? So if I want to specifically style some aspect of this page instead of the whole page, then for example, I could say I only want to style the H2 tags. So the H2 tags, I'm going to make Helvetica. So I'm just going to change body to H2. So now it's going to go look at the page, it's going to find H2 tags, and for those H2 tags, it's going to set their font to Helvetica or sans serif. Everything else is going to be left in the default. So if I save that and go back, now you see we've got a mix of fonts, right? The main heading here is in Times New Roman or some serif, but the H2 tags here, here, and here, they've become Helvetica. So it's a more specific selection of elements on the page. But again, we're just selecting by the tag, right? That's all that we're doing, is we're just choosing a specific tag and we're saying everything inside that tag on this page, even if there's lots of them, apply this style to it, change their font to Helvetica. Now, this may be obvious, but it's worth knowing. It's really important to know. We don't have to just set one property when we are styling something. We can set multiple properties just by listing one per line. So we set the font family, but there's another property called color, for example. And I want to set the color of my H2 tags to something. I'll make it sort of pink. Pink. So here I'm using a hexadecimal specification, right? So this is a hexadecimal color. You're probably already familiar with these. It's more red, so mostly red, that's the FF, and then the green and the blue are set to 88 in hexadecimal. So now we're specifying both the font and the color. So if I go back and I look at that, now my headings are Helvetica and a beautiful kind of, salmon pink, a nice sort of pink color. So we're really, we're getting a bit more specific about what we're trying to do. And then I hope, of course, we can specify other selectors. We don't just have one selector in CSS, we can list more. So for example, I could style the H1 tag, and I could set maybe its font size property. That's another property that exists. The font size, I can set the font size in a lot of different ways. And this is another thing that I'll bring up again in a moment. There's this question of units, and how do you specify how much of something you might want. A really good unit to use for font sizes is the REM. So I'm going to set it to 3 rem units. REM stands for relative EM unit, which is sort of, feels like infinite kind of acronyms or something. Relative EM unit. So an EM unit is a classic typographic unit that refers to the size of literally the letter M, because it's kind of a nice square shape. That's why they use it as an exemplar. So a lowercase m. And a relative m is just saying that, it prevents us getting confused about what it's relative to. The relative rem it's always relative to just the default font size of the document overall. And so 3 rem is saying I want the h1 tag to be 3 times the size of the default font on the page. That's all that 3 rem is saying. So if I go back and look at that, now the main heading is bigger, and the H2s are still styled in the same way, right? So this is a 3 rem heading. I could change that. I could make this like a 5 rem heading. Now it's even bigger, etc. 3 is probably big enough though, right? Yeah. And we can keep going like this, right? So we can choose any tag and we can set styling properties on it. Let's set another color here. We'll make the text kind of a dark gray. So that's just a dark gray. And, no, did I save that? It's kind of hard to see, right? It's sort of a subtle effect. Maybe it's quite nice. I don't know. I don't know how I feel about it. Maybe I'll make it a little bit lighter. We'll make it 6s. Sort of number of the beast color. There we go. So it's a bit faded now. So this is applying to p tags, right? So the reason that it's not applying down here is that this is in a footer tag, this contact details. But here's my p tags here, and here. And you can see that they're becoming kind of a lighter gray. So I am, by the way, I'm not saying, by no means am I trying to style this page so that it looks super beautiful. It's not one of my strengths, and I'm not going to pretend that we're going to end up with a gorgeous result. What we want to know right now is we've selected multiple different tags, and each one we are styling in different ways, potentially with multiple properties applied to each tag. You can probably already sense that one of the huge things about CSS is you need to know what the hell these properties are, right? And we'll get to that in just a second. But let's point out one last thing. So one of the other things that you find yourself often wanting to do in CSS is you might want to style multiple different selectors or these tags in the same way. So if I want to style both EM tags, so the emphasis tag, and the strong tag, the importance tag, if I want to apply the same style to both of those, I could do it separately, right? Like I could write, I want to style the strong tag, and I want to make it, here's a color. I'm just kind of copying this color from my notes, so I hope it looks nice. I could do it strong, and then I could also style the EM tag with the same color, right? 4488AA. And that will work. So I'm doing the same thing with both of these. What does it look like? Oh, that's quite nice, isn't it? Sort of a nice blue color there. So the emphasis tag is styled with that color, and the strong tag is styled with that color. And that's fine, that works. But you know, as programmers, we look at this and we see these two style selector and properties, these two styling things, they're exactly the same content. And so it would make more sense to do them both at the same time. And so in CSS, we can do that by saying strong, I want to style this way, and then we have a comma, and I also want to style EM like that way. So we can have a comma separated list of all of the selectors that we want to apply this style to. So that'll have the same result, right? There's still that same nice blue color here. So that's just to say you can select more than one thing by using a comma separated list. That's just another thing that, that you can do. Okay, so then the big question, so we've kind of covered it to some extent. It's kind of scary in the sense that it's not complicated, and then you're like, well, so why is CSS so complicated? Why is it so hard to use? Because it is it's a real journey to use CSS well. And the reason that it's complicated is because there is a lot that you can do. Okay, within this basic principle of just I select a thing and I apply some style to it. There's a lot that's possible, and the big thing that's possible, that's really important, is just the sheer quantity of properties that are available, okay? And how do you know what they are? Well, you learn over time by looking things up on the internet, by asking people questions, but perhaps, a really good thing to do and this is sort of always the case, right, is to read the documentation. So if you go to Mozilla, they have really good documentation on CSS, the cascading style sheets. Now, there's tutorials, there's an introduction, etc., etc. But just to give you a sense, let's take a look at the exhaustive CSS reference. Now, I'm not suggesting that you just read this for your weekend reading or anything like this. Here's your basic syntax stuff again. Let's just get down here. So these are all of the properties, okay? There are a lot. I'm just going to scroll through them just for a second. Scroll, 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 scrolling. I'm still scrolling. This is a lot. There's a lot. Oh my goodness. There's a lot, okay? There's a lot of properties. These all do interesting things on your page, and it's perfectly reasonable to just kind of like have a little read of this and see things that you think might be useful. You know, there's our friend color there, for example, right? We were using color just before. If we click through to color and take a look at its documentation, we get a decent amount of information about how it works. Most importantly, and quite usefully, we get information here about different ways that we can specify a color. You can see, this is the one that we've been using, right? We've been using this style where we use hexadecimal. But you can also see that there's weird things like Rebecca purple is a color. So you can actually use named color names, like you can write black or white or yellow, and it will interpret that if it's a color that it knows. You can see we can also use RGB values by writing RGB and then the RGB values in parentheses if you feel more comfortable doing that sort of thing. There's also HSL, which is hue, saturation, and lightness. That's a different color model that we might want to use. There's HSLA, that's the same thing with an alpha value at the end. So they're using a 0.3 alpha value in this one. And so on. Initial means the default. So there are many, many possibilities, and every single one of them is pretty nicely documented. Oh, here's the very literal, here's all of the possible ways that you could potentially set your color. And there's all kinds of, there's more discussion, right? Accessibility is a really important thing because of things like color blindness, for example. There's the syntax, there's examples, and it goes into the actual specifications, which browsers support this property. This is just for one single property in this massive list that we were looking at, right? So this is true for all of them. So it's always worth reading the documentation because you'll just learn a lot about what's possible. And this is especially true for things like units, right? So if we go and look at font size, which we were using as well, and I was using 3REM, you can see again there's different ways of setting your font size. There's EM units without the R. There's sizes like extra small and smaller, looks like that. 12px, you can set fonts by a pixel size, you can set them by a percentage size. And again, there's many, 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 many options here that you might want to use. So a huge list of really useful possibilities here. And again, descriptions and thoughts about how all of this works, EM units, and so on and so forth. And there's a huge description here, just like literally of how EM units work, and then REM units, etc. Okay? So reading the documentation is the way that you're going to get better at this, as well as seeing examples and practicing and looking things up and asking for help. So it's as simple as this. It's just what you put in, right? And a lot of working with computers is like that. So what else do I need to tell you in order for us to feel like we can just use CSS by reading the documentation and examples? There's one more really important kind of selection idea that I want to talk about, and this is the idea of ID and class, okay? So currently the way that we're selecting everything on this web page is by tag name. So we've got H1, H2, we've got P, we've got strong, and we've got EM, right? All of those are a specific tag name, and so whatever styling we do there is going to be applied to all of the tags that have all of the tags with that name in the document. And that's clearly very useful, but it's also very clear that if we want a little bit more fine-grained control over how things look, we're not going to want to always style by tag, right? What if we want one of the H2 headings to have one color, and then we want a different H2 heading to have a different color? If we can only specify by the tag, we're not going to be able to have that level of control. And so this is where we learn two new attributes that we use in HTML that are specifically designed to cooperate with CSS. And they're called ID and class. Okay? So an ID attribute, we use it when we have a unique element in our HTML that we want to be able to style in CSS, and we're saying that it's the only one of its kind. So an ID means that it's unique. So let's say, what is unique? Let's say that these section IDs are unique. So here's the first section tag here. Currently it can't be distinguished by CSS from the second section tag, right? They're both just a section. So if I style section, it's going to apply to both of these. So what if I want to make them both unique? I add inside the tag the word ID, which is the name of the attribute, and then I give it a name. So I'm going to call it first section. So now this section is unique. It's got an ID of first section, and I'll do the same thing for the other one. It's going to have an ID of, you guessed it, second section. Now I'm able to style these two sections differently, right? Because I've made them unique by giving them an ID each. Now how do I do that? How do I change something about these sections? Well, I do it in my CSS, of course, and I need some way of saying, how do I choose these two different sections? I do it by using their ID. So the first thing that you might imagine is that you just write the name, right? So this first section is what it's called, and then I would apply something to it. So let's give it a background color. And let's use the RGB approach this time. So RGB, let's make it a gray color. Okay. This is not going to work. We head back over to our page. So here's the first section. Here, it's all of this stuff, right, is inside that section tag, but nothing has happened. It hasn't changed color at all. Its background color hasn't changed. And the reason for that is because we only select tags this way by just writing the name. If I want to select an ID, because we know that we have ID of first section here, I need to use a special symbol. And that special symbol is a hash. And we put it in front of the name of the ID. So the hash means ID, and then we write the name that the ID was assigned for the thing that we're styling. So the first section has an ID of first section, so we write hash first section. And now if we go back and look, it looks horrible because I'm a horrible person. However, we can now see that this background color has been applied to this first section. So everything inside the first section, which is the heading and the paragraph, now has this background. And we can do the same thing for the second section, right? Hash second section to select the second section by its ID, and we can give it a background color that's different. RGB 100, 200, what? I feel like I'm on the spot. There we go. That's probably going to look truly awful. No, it's not as bad as it could be. So now we've selected the second section, right? And the important thing is because we gave each one of those an ID, we can treat it as a unique element on the page. We're not reliant on using its tag name. So each of those has a unique ID. We can style them separately. And clearly that's going to be an important kind of thing that we need to do sometimes. So what else might we want to do? Well, the other thing that we're probably going to want to do sometimes in our document here is we're going to want to style multiple elements, but we're not going to want to style every element that has the same tag. So for example, if we wanted to style just the p tags here inside this section, there's actually a couple of ways that you can do this, but I'm going to do the easiest way. I can't just target the p, the paragraph tag, because that would style this paragraph too, and I don't want that. So I need some way of saying that these p tags are special, and they go in a kind of a group. And the way that we do that is we say that they are in the same class. So we use the special class attribute. And I'll say that this is second section paragraph. Quite a long-winded name there. And same thing for this one, right? Class second section paragraph. Now the class attribute that we're using here, that is used to say that I want to style this kind of thing, but there could be multiple instances of this class throughout my document, okay? So ID means I'm promising there's only one of this thing. Class means that there may be a collection of these things throughout the document. So it's a class of thing. So we have two second section paragraphs that we can now style as we wish. So what are we going to do with these second section paragraphs? Well, so again, we are going to need a special symbol to say that we're working with class, right? Because I can't just say second section paragraph and then style it, because we know this kind of writing is reserved just for tag names. That's why it's gone red. So how do I say that this is a class? I can't use hash because we know that that refers to an ID. If we want it to be a class, we use a dot. That's the notation that we use. So dot and then the name of the class is going to select every element that has that class name associated with it. And what can I do with it? Oh God, I mean, I don't know. Let's set its font size to be a bit bigger. So its font size, I'm going to set to 1.5 rem units. And while I'm at it, I'm going to give it a line height as well. Its line height is going to be 1.5 rem units as well. That's going to look weird. So let's go look at it. So there it is there, right? So we've made the font larger and the line height larger. Actually, the line height is not really doing a lot because this is not a multi-line. It's not a multi-line paragraph, so that's a bit pointless. But you know, that's my level of CSS, right? I'm so smart. So we've managed now to target this paragraph and this paragraph by giving them both the same class, and by targeting that class, we can affect those two paragraphs but leave this paragraph alone. It's just this basic idea of wanting to be able to target very specific parts of our web page in order to make sure that our styling and our layout is being applied the way that we want it to be applied. Okay? Those are super common. You'll see them in every HTML page you ever look at. They are, in many ways, the main way that people style their HTML with CSS is with ID and class. Okay, there's a couple of more things that I would like to just mention because they're useful. Now, one thing that we've currently got is we can use IDs and classes to select specific bits of our text. But another thing that we probably want to be able to do is, currently we're styling whole blocks, right? We're still styling based on whole tags. So even when we add this class, right, we're still styling the entire paragraph. Or we're styling the entire section. Sometimes you want to just style a little bit of text within something else, right? And to do that, we need some kind of neutral tag that can go around some text that we can still target. Because, for example, if I want to target this phrase here, paragraph of text, how am I going to target that? Well, it needs a tag around it because otherwise it's not separate from the rest of the text inside this p tag. But I don't want to add a tag around it that does something else to it, right? If I add, for example, an EM tag around this, it's going to be italic, which I don't want. If I add an A tag around it, it's going to turn into a link. So I want something that's neutral, that's just about designating a section of text so that I can do something to that section of text, so that I can style it. And the name of that tag, of course it exists. Why would I be talking about it? Otherwise, the name of that tag is span. So if I put a span tag around this text here, now this doesn't do anything to the text. It's just separating it out from everything else and saying that it's a unit on its own, right? If we go and look at it here, you can see the words paragraph of text there are fine. They're not being affected by the span tag. There's no line breaks. There's no impact on it visually or in terms of layout. It's just so that I could potentially do something to it. And so what we could do is we could have a span, and then if I want to do something with the span, I should probably give it a class or an ID. I'm going to give it a class of, what am I going to say? I'm just going to call it paragraph of text. That's stupid, but there you go. Paragraph of text, and I'll do it here too since I use that phrase there as well. Span around the words paragraph of text, and then I'll give it the same class of paragraph of text. So what this enables me to do is not style this with the tag and not affect it in any way because it's inside a tag, but then to target this class, and then I can do things to just those three words in those two places, right? So if I target this class now, paragraph of text, if I select it rather, so paragraph of, oh goodness me, of text. Oh, and I've broken my CSS there, so let me just fix it. So that's selecting the paragraph of text class. That's why I've got this dot in front of it. And then I can do something to it. Again, why don't I just affect its font size? Let's get stupid. So font size, and I'll make this, I don't want to make it too big, do I? I don't want to be too stupid. I'll make it really small. That's better. I'll make it 0.5 rem. So the great thing here is if we go and look at it, now there it is there, right? There's paragraph of text, the first one, there's the second one. And because it was inside a span, only the styling of the text size is impacting it. It still fits into the page flow, the text flow of the document is still all of the same. It's just because it's in a span, I can impact aspects of its styling. So that's what span tags are for. They are just potentially useful to be able to style bits of text within other tags in ways that you want to. Okay. God, that's an ugly page. I'm so sorry that you have to be seeing this. But, you know, that just should inspire you to do better. So there are other things to say about CSS. The biggest thing, as I've said, is you need to read the documentation and look at examples to know particularly what are the properties that I can use to style things. That's really the biggest part of CSS. What are the properties? How do they work? Just one more thing that it's good to know about is this idea of pseudo classes. So pseudo classes allow us to add ideas to selection, often to do with interactivity or like sort of more mathematical ideas. So one pseudo tag that exists is the hover tag. So I'll just use this as an example. So I can select the h1 tag, but if I add a pseudo class to it of hover, like hover like this, what I'm saying is, so this is selecting the h1 tag in all its instances and always setting its font size to 3 rem units, rems. I can also select the h1 tag in the specific case where it's being hovered over. So that's an interactive selection, right? Sometimes the h1 tag has the mouse hovered over it, sometimes it doesn't. Any styling that I do in here with this pseudo class applied is only going to be applied while the hover is going on. So for example, I could just change its color to whatever, red. And this style here, it's only going to be applied when the hover is happening, right? So normally nothing, it's black. And when I hover over it, now it's red. And I take my mouse off, it's not red, red, not red, red, not red. What a beautiful way to make visual changes to an element on your page that react to the mouse that don't involve you writing a whole lot of JavaScript, right? Now this can only, this only gives us the power to change stuff about its CSS. So, I could also make it a different size. Maybe I could make it a little bit bigger when I mouse over it, 3.25 rems. So now it gets a little bit bigger at the same time that I mouse over it. But this is a great way to add a lot of those simple interactions that you often want for user experience, for example. This gives you a really strong and easy way of doing it without writing any code. So there's a lot more to pseudo classes, and so it's worth looking them up. And again, the documentation is great here in terms of what's possible. But just be aware that there's this idea of these sorts of extra selection ideas, that you can do selection that's quite a bit more complicated and sophisticated than just by tag, or just by ID, or just by class, right? That's just worth knowing as you move forwards. I think that's enough of an introduction that you can now use CSS, you can understand the basics, and you can start, if you're not already familiar with it, this should enable you to start using it and just kind of playing around. Again, I'm not expecting anyone to be a master of CSS thanks to this discussion. The only other two things I would like to mention that you might want to take a look at, other than just like learning the properties and the possible values that you can set the properties to, are a big part of CSS that I haven't looked at here, simply because it would, I think, take us too much time, is layout. There's a lot of layout stuff that you can do with CSS, like, turning things into columns or grids, etc. And indeed, there's one specific new aspect of CSS called CSS Grid that is a very popular way of getting a lot of control over the layout of your web page in terms of where things are positioned on the page. The other thing it's really worth taking a look at, because it's super fun, is animation through CSS. So you can actually have things that animate in CSS, and you can sort of define the entire animation just in CSS, okay? Those are things to look up and to sort of enjoy about CSS. And so that's kind of it in terms of what I have to say about the absolute basics of CSS. Now you understand that to some extent it's just select something on the web page and style it with the properties that you want to style it with. And we also know, very importantly, that you can select things with tags. Oh, my hands are behind my hair. That's creepy. You can select things with tags. You can select things with ID if they're unique on the page, with class if there's a class of things on the page that you want to be able to style. And then there's also these ideas like pseudo classes, but also comma separated lists. And there's a bit more. It can get pretty sophisticated. But now you know the basics of selection and styling. That's all that there really is to CSS. Everything else is just icing on the cake there. Okay. So that's it for me and the CSS overview. Go forth and CSS, and get as good at it as you want to. Okay. See you next time.